I can still smell it. That's what people don't understand when I tell them about Vietnam. They think memory fades, that 50 years is enough time to soften the edges of things, to let the hard parts dissolve like sugar in rain. But some smells don't fade. The smell of kerosene mixed with burning thatch, the sweet, sick odor of napalm residue hanging in jungle air, the particular stench of fear sweat that soaked through our fatigues in those endless, suffocating days. These things have a permanence that defies time. They live in some part of my brain that age can't touch, that whiskey couldn't drown, that 50 years of trying to forget hasn't diminished even slightly. My name is Robert James Mitchell, though everyone called me Mitch back then, and I served with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade of the Americall Division from February 1968 to March 1970. I was 19 years old when I stepped off that transport plane into the blast furnace heat of Tan Son Hut Air Base, and I was 21 when I left, though I felt about 100 years older. But there's one day that stands apart from all the others, one village whose name I never learned, one decision that wasn't mine to make but that I've carried like a stone in my chest for half a century. It was late September 1969, during the monsoon season when the Mekong Delta turned into a maze of swollen rivers and flooded rice paddies that reflected the gray sky like sheets of hammered steel. We've been operating in Dinh Tuong Province, running search and destroy missions through villages that all looked the same to me. Clusters of hooches with thatched roofs and mud walls, banana trees drooping heavy with fruit, water buffalo standing knee-deep in paddy water, watching us with ancient, indifferent eyes. The villages were connected by narrow dikes that crisscrossed the flooded fields, and we'd walk single file along those dikes, fully exposed, knowing that any tree line could hide a sniper, any rice paddy could conceal a punji pit, any smiling child could be leading us toward an ambush. We'd lost 3 guys the week before. Johnson stepped on a mine that tore him apart from the waist down. We found pieces of him in the trees 20 yards away. Martinez took a sniper around through the throat while we were crossing a river, and he drowned in his own blood before we could drag him to the bank. And Henderson, sweet kid from Ohio who kept a picture of his girlfriend taped inside his helmet, simply disappeared one night during his watch. We found his rifle leaning against a tree, his helmet on the ground, and nothing else. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. He just vanished into the jungle like he'd never existed at all. And somehow that was worse than the other deaths because it left us with questions that would never have answers. So we were already on edge when Lieutenant Crane gathered us that morning near a bombed-out Buddhist temple. The temple had been beautiful once, you could tell. Ornate carvings still visible on the stone foundation, fragments of gold paint clinging to pieces of statuary that lay shattered in the mud. Now, it was just another ruin in a country full of ruins, another place where something sacred had been destroyed by something profane. The morning air was thick and wet, heavy with the promise of rain, and mosquitoes swarmed around us in clouds so dense you'd breathe them in if you opened your mouth too wide. Crane was a West Point graduate, 24 years old, ramrod straight even in the crushing humidity, with eyes that had gone hard and distant in the 6 months since he'd arrived in country. He'd come over full of idealism and tactical theory, talking about winning hearts and minds, about surgical precision in combat operations. But Vietnam had a way of grinding that idealism down to nothing, of teaching you that theories meant jack shit when your friend's intestines were steaming on the ground in front of you. By that September, Crane had stopped talking about hearts and minds. He just gave orders, and we followed them, because that's what you did, because thinking too much about why could get you killed. Intelligence says there's a VC supply route running through a village about 3 clicks northwest of here, Crane said, unfolding a plastic cover map that was stained with red dirt and sweat. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a manual. The village has been flagged as a suspected VC haven. Local ARVN forces report weapons fire coming from that direction. Our orders are to search the village, secure any weapons or contraband, and if we encounter resistance or find evidence of VC activity, we're authorized to destroy the village to deny the enemy its use as a staging area. I remember looking around at the other guys. Thompson, who we called tiny even though he was 6'4" and built like a linebacker. Rodriguez, a tough kid from the Bronx who kept rosary beads wrapped around his wrist. Kowalski, who never stopped talking, filling every silence with nervous chatter about his plan to open a garage back in Detroit. Davis, whose 1,000-yard stare had gotten worse with each passing month. And Jackson, the only brother in our squad, who'd stopped smiling after, watching a white phosphorus round cook off too close to a group of civilians. We were all thinking the same thing, but nobody said it. What constituted evidence of VC activity? A rice cache? A tunnel? A young man who ran instead of staying to be questioned? The lines had gotten so blurred by then that everything looked suspicious and nothing looked certain. We moved out in a tactical column, weapons at the ready, every sense straining against the oppressive heat and humidity. The temperature must have been over 100 degrees, and the air was so thick it felt like breathing through a wet towel. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes, soaking my uniform until it clung to my skin like a second layer. The weight of my gear, the M16, the ammunition, the grenades, the pack with sea rations, and extra socks that never stayed dry, seemed to increase with every step, dragging me down into the mud that sucked to my boots with each footfall. The jungle around us was alive with sound. The screech of birds, the chatter of monkeys, the constant drone of insects. But underneath those sounds, we were listening for other things. The click of a rifle being cocked, the whisper of movement through the undergrowth, the almost inaudible hiss of a fuse burning toward detonation. In Vietnam, silence could kill you, but so could noise. You learn to exist in this constant state of hypervigilance, your nerves scraped raw, your mind processing 1,000 signals simultaneously, trying to separate the normal from the deadly. We crossed 3 rivers on the way to the village, wading through brown water that came up to our chests, holding our rifles above our heads, vulnerable and slow, praying that no one would open fire while we were halfway across. In the water, you could feel things brushing against your legs, fish, vegetation, or something worse. A guy in 3rd Platoon had been bitten by a water snake the month before and died screaming as the venom coursed through his system, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the mud while the medic frantically tried to find a vein for the anti-venom. After that, every ripple in the water looked like a threat. When we finally reached the village, it was around noon, and the sun had broken through the clouds just enough to turn the delta into a steam bath. The village was small, maybe 20 hooches arranged in a rough circle around a central area where chickens scratched in the dirt. There was a well in the center, and some cooking fires that had been recently extinguished, sending thin trails of smoke into the heavy air. The place felt empty, too quiet, like a stage set waiting for actors who'd never arrive. "Fan out," Crane ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Check every structure. Eyes open." We moved through the village in pairs, kicking in the thin doors of hooches, searching for the meager possessions of people who had almost nothing to begin with. In one hut, I found a family altar with faded photographs and burned down incense sticks. In another, a child's toy, a crude wooden water buffalo that someone had carved with love and patience. There were sleeping mats rolled in corners, clay pots for cooking rice, fishing nets hanging from the rafters. The ordinary details of ordinary lives. But there were no people. The village was deserted, and that fact alone made it suspicious. In our experience, if a village was empty when we arrived, it usually meant one of 2 things. Either someone had warned them we were coming, or they were VC themselves and had melted into the jungle to wait for an opportunity to ambush us. The absence of civilians was evidence of guilt. That's what we'd been trained to believe anyway. It never occurred to us, or maybe it did, but we couldn't afford to think about it, that people might flee simply because they'd learned that American soldiers showing up in your village often meant death, whether you were VC or not. "Lieutenant, we got something," Rodriguez called from the far end of the village. We converged on his position and found what he'd discovered, a concealed trapdoor leading to a tunnel system beneath one of the hooches. Tunnel systems were classic VC, a network of underground passages used for hiding, for moving supplies, for launching surprise attacks. Finding one was considered proof positive of enemy activity. Crane stared down into the dark opening of the tunnel, his jaw working silently. "Anybody want to go down there?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Nobody volunteered for tunnel rat duty. The tunnels were death traps, narrow, pitch-black passages that could be rigged with explosives, filled with snakes or scorpions, or simply lead to a small chamber where a VC soldier waited with a knife or a pistol. Better to just seal them up or toss in a grenade. But before Crane could make a decision, we heard it, the sharp crack of a rifle shot from the tree line about 200 yards away. The round hit the dirt near Kowalski's feet, and we all hit the ground, scrambling for cover behind the hooches, behind the well, behind anything that might stop a bullet. More shots followed, the distinctive pop-pop-pop of AK-47s mixed with the deeper boom of what might have been an SKS carbine. "Return fire," Crane was shouting, and we did, sending rounds into the tree line, not really aiming at anything specific, just filling the space with lead and noise. The firefight lasted maybe 5 minutes, though time does strange things in combat. Sometimes it stretches out until each second feels like an hour, and sometimes it compresses until whole minutes disappear into a blur of action and reaction. When the firing stopped, the silence that followed was profound and eerie, broken only by the ringing in our ears and our own ragged breathing. Nobody was hit on our side, which was either luck or proof that the VC hadn't really been trying to kill us. Just sending a message, establishing presence, reminding us that we didn't control this territory no matter what the maps back at base camp said. Crane's face was flushed red, whether from heat or anger, I couldn't tell. He looked at the village, at the tunnel entrance, at the tree line where the shots had come from, and I could see him doing the calculation in his head. We'd taken fire from or near this village. There was a tunnel system. The villagers had fled before we arrived, suggesting foreknowledge. In the algebra of Vietnam, this added up to one conclusion. "Burn it," he said quietly, then louder. "Burn the whole fucking village. Every hooch, every structure. I want this place gone." There was a moment where nobody moved. We all just stood there in the midday heat, and I remember thinking that this was a decision point, a moment where we could choose something different. I remember opening my mouth, maybe to say, "Sir, are you sure? Or shouldn't we call this in?" Or something, anything that might change what was about to happen. But I didn't say anything. I just closed my mouth and looked down at my boots, at the mud caking them, at anything except Crane's eyes or the eyes of the other guys in my squad. Thompson pulled out a Zippo lighter, one of those chrome ones that guys would get engraved with their short timer calendars or unit mottos or girlfriend names. It said, "Yeah," though I walked through the valley of the shadow of death on one side. He'd shown it to me once, proud of it, though I'd never understood why anyone would want to carry around a reminder of that particular Bible verse. Now he was using it to set fire to someone's home, and there was something obscene about that, about using an object that referenced God to do something that felt so far from any God I'd ever believed in. The thatched roofs caught quickly despite the humidity. The dry season might have been over, but there was enough old, dead plant matter in those roofs that they went up like kindling once the flames got started. We moved methodically from hooch to hooch, and some guys used Zippos, and some guys just tossed in white phosphorus grenades that would burn through almost anything, and some guys used their cigarette lighters, and one guy, I think it was Jackson, just used a burning branch from a cooking fire like we were cavemen discovering fire instead of soldiers destroying homes. The smell hit me first. Burning thatch has a particular odor, acrid and bitter, mixed with the smell of burning wood and bamboo. But then other smells joined it as the fires grew and spread and consumed everything in those hooches. Burning fabric, burning rice, burning photographs and keepsakes, and all the small things that make a place a home rather than just a structure. And underneath it all, the chemical smell of the white phosphorus, which burns with an intensity that's almost surgical, reaching temperatures that can melt metal, that can burn underwater, that can't be extinguished by anything except complete oxygen deprivation. The heat from the fires added to the already oppressive heat of the day. It became hard to breathe. The smoke rose in thick black columns that I knew would be visible for miles, marking our location, announcing what we'd done to anyone who cared to look. I wondered if the villagers were watching from somewhere in the jungle, watching their homes burn, watching their lives disappear into smoke and ash. I wondered if they were VC, if they'd been the ones shooting at us, if this was somehow justified. I wondered if it mattered. Kowalski wouldn't shut up, filling the smoke-choked air with his nervous chatter. Just following orders, right? I mean, they shot at us. We found the tunnels. This is standard operating procedure. This is what we're supposed to do, right? This is right. He wasn't asking anyone in particular, just talking to convince himself, and nobody answered him because we were all trying to convince ourselves of the same thing. We found the first one and the third hooch we set on fire. Rodriguez was the one who saw her, and his shout brought us running. Through the smoke and flames, barely visible in the corner of the hooch that hadn't fully caught yet, was an old woman. She must have been 80, maybe 90 years old, so small and frail she looked like she was made of rice paper and bird bones. She was curled in the corner, either hiding or too infirm to flee when everyone else left, and now she was trapped. Jesus Christ, Thompson breathed, and he dropped the board he'd been using to poke through the remains of another hooch. There's somebody in there. Crane's face went white, then red, and for a second I thought he might be sick. But he recovered quickly, his West Point training kicking in, his voice steady when he said, "Get her out. Now, Rodriguez, Thompson, get her out of there." They went in, covering their faces with their arms, moving low under the smoke that was already filling the hooch like a living thing. The roof was starting to go, pieces of burning thatch falling down, and I remember thinking they had maybe 30 seconds before the whole structure collapsed. They grabbed the old woman, who was making this high, keening sound that wasn't quite words, and dragged her out into the open air. She was coughing, her face covered in soot, her eyes wide and white with terror. But we weren't done finding people. Davis found an old man in another hooch, and Kowalski found 2 children. Couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, hiding in a clay pot that was big enough to hold them both if they curled up tight. They came out crying, and the sound of children crying is something that cuts through everything else, every justification, every rationalization, every order from every lieutenant. In total, we pulled 7 people out of that village. 7 people who hadn't fled, either because they couldn't or because they'd thought hiding was safer than running. 7 people we'd nearly burn alive because we'd assumed the village was empty, because we'd been trained to see absence as evidence of guilt, because we were angry and scared and following orders. The old woman kept talking in Vietnamese, her voice high and cracking, and I didn't need a translator to understand what she was saying. She was asking why. Why were we burning her home? Why were we destroying everything? What had she done? And we had no answers for her. Crane tried to radio in for a medevac to take the villagers to a refugee center, but the radio crackled with static and distant voices, and the response was that no helicopter would come for non-combatants unless they were wounded. Not a priority, the voice on the radio said, flat and bureaucratic. You'll have to escort them to the nearest ARVN checkpoint. So that's what we did. We walked those 7 people, the old woman, the old man, 3 women who might have been their daughters, and the 2 children, 3 kilometers through the jungle and rice paddies to a South Vietnamese army checkpoint, while behind us their village continued to burn, black smoke still rising into the gray sky. The old woman cried the entire way, a constant keening sound that reminded me of an animal in pain. The children were silent, holding tight to their mother's hands, their eyes huge and dark and utterly devoid of trust or hope. At the checkpoint, an ARVN officer took custody of the villagers with obvious reluctance. He spoke English, and he said to Crane, "These people have nowhere to go now. The refugee camps are full. They will probably try to go back to their village, and when they find nothing left, they will either starve or they will join the VC. This is how you make more enemies." Crane's jaw tightened, and he said, "We found tunnels. We took fire from that location. This is standard operating procedure." The ARVN officer looked at him with something like pity or maybe contempt and said, "Yes, standard. That is the problem." Then he turned away, leading the villagers toward a cluster of tents that looked temporary and inadequate, places where people could exist but not live, survive but not thrive. We walked back to our base camp in silence. The rain that had been threatening all day finally came, a heavy tropical downpour that turned the paths to mud and soaked us to the skin in seconds. The rain felt like a baptism that couldn't wash anything clean, water that fell, but couldn't rinse away what we'd done. Kowalski had finally stopped talking. Jackson stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. Rodriguez fingered his rosary beads, his lips moving in silent prayer. Thompson kept clenching and unclenching his fists, like he wanted to hit something but couldn't figure out what. That night, back at base camp, I lay in my bunk and stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent and tried to process what had happened. I told myself that we'd been following orders. I told myself that we'd taken fire, that there had been tunnels, that in a guerrilla war the lines between civilian and combatant were always blurred. I told myself that we'd saved 7 people, that if we hadn't checked those hooches more carefully they would have died, that in a way we were heroes. I told myself all these things, but none of them felt true, or at least none of them felt like enough to balance the weight pressing down on my chest. The truth was simpler and more terrible. We'd burned a village because we were scared and angry, and because we had the power to do so. We'd burned it because 3 of our friends had died that week, and we needed to hurt someone to strike back at an enemy we could rarely see and almost never catch. We'd burned it because in Vietnam the categories of right and wrong had been replaced by the categories of us in them, and anyone who wasn't clearly us was probably them, and anything that might help them could be destroyed. We'd burned it because it was easier to burn than to think, easier to follow orders than to question, easier to act than to consider consequences. I tried writing a letter home that night, but I couldn't figure out how to explain it to my mom and dad back in Pennsylvania. Couldn't find words that would make sense to people who watched the war on television, who saw sanitized reports about body counts and strategic hamlets and winning hearts and minds. How could I explain that we nearly burned 7 people alive because we thought their village was empty? How could I make them understand that this was normal, that this happened all the time, that villages burned across Vietnam every single day for reasons that seemed to make sense in the moment, but that dissolved into moral ambiguity as soon as you examined them too closely? So I didn't write about it. I wrote about the heat and the rain and the food and how I missed home and how I was staying safe. The same lies everyone told, the same careful omissions, the same editing of reality to make it palatable for people who needed to believe we were the good guys fighting the good fight. And maybe we were on some grand strategic level that colonels and generals understood. But on the ground, in the mud and blood and smoke, good and bad seemed like concepts from a different world, a cleaner place where choices were clear and consequences were proportional. The months that followed blur together now, a succession of patrols and firefights in villages that all looked the same. We lost more guys. I got a piece of shrapnel in my leg from a mortar round that left me with a limp I still have on cold days. Crane got rotated out and replaced by a new lieutenant who lasted 3 weeks before stepping on a mine. The Tet Offensive came and went, and then another one, and the peace talks in Paris dragged on while we kept fighting a war that everyone seemed to agree was unwinnable, but that nobody could figure out how to end. I made it home in March 1970, landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, and within 24 hours I was back in Pennsylvania, standing in my parents' living room in my dress uniform, trying to figure out who this person was that they were looking at, because it sure as hell wasn't the kid who'd left 2 years earlier. My mom kept saying how proud she was, how brave I'd been, and I nodded and smiled and felt like a fraud, because whatever bravery was, I hadn't seen much of it in Vietnam. I'd seen survival. I'd seen endurance. I'd seen men doing terrible things and good things, often in the same day, sometimes in the same hour, and I'd learned that humans are capable of both extraordinary heroism and extraordinary cruelty, often simultaneously. I tried to talk about it once, at a dinner party my parents threw to celebrate my return. Someone asked what it was really like over there, and I started to tell them about the village, about the old woman, about the smell of burning thatch, and I saw their faces change, saw the discomfort creep in, saw them realize they'd asked a question they didn't actually want answered. My dad put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Why don't we talk about something else? Mitch is home now. That's what matters." and everyone nodded gratefully and changed the subject to football or the weather or anything except the war. That's when I understood that I'd never be able to explain it. Not really. The distance between what I'd experienced and what people at home could understand was unbridgeable. They'd seen the war on the evening news, watched it between commercials for soap and cereal, treated it like a show that they could turn off when it got too disturbing. I'd lived it, breathed it, carried it in my bones and blood, and those were two completely different things. I tried to go back to normal life. Got a job at a factory. Got married to a girl I'd known in high school. Had 2 kids. Did all the things you're supposed to do, all the markers of a normal American life. But the village was always there, lurking in the background like a shadow that never quite went away. I'd smell something, a neighbor burning leaves in autumn, smoke from a barbecue grill, and suddenly I'd be back there, watching those hooches burn, hearing that old woman's crying, feeling the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me like a physical thing. The nightmare started about 6 months after I got home. I'd dream I was back in a village, but this time I couldn't get the people out, couldn't pull them from the burning hooches, and I'd watch them die over and over, their faces changing, sometimes looking like the old woman, sometimes looking like my wife or my kids or my parents. I'd wake up soaking wet, my heart hammering, my wife shaking me and asking what was wrong. And I'd tell her it was nothing, just a bad dream. Because how could I explain that I'd nearly burned people alive, that I'd followed orders that led to the destruction of everything those people owned, that I participated in something that felt more like a war crime than an act of military necessity? My marriage didn't last. She tried, God knows she tried, but living with someone who jumps at loud noises, who can't celebrate the 4th of July because fireworks sound too much like incoming mortars, who drinks too much and talks too little and carries around a guilt he can't explain or exorcise. That's not a marriage. That's a prison sentence for both people. We divorced in 1978, and she got custody of the kids, which was probably for the best. I wasn't much of a father. How could I teach my kids right from wrong when I'd participated in something that destroyed the distinction between the two? I found other veterans eventually, guys who'd been in Vietnam, who understood without needing explanations. We'd meet at the VFW hall, drink cheap beer, and talk about things we couldn't talk about with anyone else. Some of them had it worse than me. One guy had been at My Lai, another had been a tunnel rat who'd killed 17 people in underground combat, so close he could feel their breath on his face. We never judged each other. We couldn't. We'd all done things, seen things, been part of a machine that ground up everything in its path, including us. Years passed. Decades. I got older. My hair turned gray and then white. My limp got worse. My kids grew up and had kids of their own, and I tried to be a better grandfather than I've been a father, try to show them love and patience and all the things I'd been too damaged to give their parents. Sometimes they'd ask about Vietnam, and I'd show them my medals, tell them sanitized stories about helicopter rides and sleeping in the jungle and the time we found a tiger that had been killed by artillery fire. I never told them about the village. How could I? How could I explain to these innocent children that their grandfather had been part of something that still felt fundamentally wrong 50 years later? But it gnaws at you, keeping secrets like that. It eats away at whatever's left of your soul, bit by bit, year by year, until you feel hollowed out like you're made of papier-mâché instead of flesh and blood. I started having panic attacks in my 60s, these sudden moments where I couldn't breathe, where I felt like I was drowning in air, where all I could see was smoke and flames and that old woman's face. The doctors said it was PTSD, gave me pills that made me feel numb, and maybe numb was better than feeling, but it was also worse in its own way, like I was becoming less human with each pill I swallowed. I tried going back once in 2002. Vietnam was open to tourists by then. The war transformed into history. The battlefields turned into tourist attractions. I hired a guide, a young man who'd been born after the war ended, and I tried to find a village we'd burned. But the Mekong Delta had changed beyond recognition. The paddies I remembered had been drained or developed. The rivers had changed course. The villages had merged or moved or simply disappeared. I spent 3 days driving around with increasingly desperate instructions. It was near a bomb temple. There was a river crossing. It was about 3 clicks from an ARVN checkpoint, but we never found it. Maybe it had been rebuilt. Maybe it was still abandoned, a ghost village slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. Maybe I'd misremembered the location, or maybe the landscape had changed so much that the village I remembered had simply ceased to exist in any physical form. In a way, not finding it was worse than finding it would have been. At least if I'd found it, I could have apologized, could have tried to make some kind of amends, could have performed some ritual of atonement that might have eased the weight I'd carried for 3 decades. But there was nothing to apologize to, no one to ask forgiveness from, just a landscape that had moved on, that had healed its wounds and forgotten, while I remained stuck in 1969, forever standing in that village, watching it burn. The guide asked me why I wanted to find this particular village, and I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, tangled up in guilt and shame and a desperate need to justify what couldn't be justified. He listened politely, and when I finished, he said something I'll never forget. The war hurt everyone. It hurt the people who died, but it also hurt the people who lived. You're still fighting the war in your mind. Maybe the village doesn't want to be found because the finding would not help you. Maybe you need to let the village stay lost. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I think I do now. Some wounds don't heal. Some things can't be fixed or forgiven or forgotten. You just learn to live with them. Carry them like stones in your pockets. Feel their weight with every step until eventually the weight becomes part of you, inseparable from who you are. I'm 74 years old now. My health is failing. Emphysema from all those years of smoking, trying to calm nerves that never calmed, and arthritis in every joint, and a heart that doesn't work as well as it used to. The doctors tell me I've got maybe 5 years left, maybe 10 if I'm lucky, though I'm not sure luck has anything to do with it. And I'm not sure more years is a blessing or a curse. And as I face the end of my life, I find myself thinking more and more about that village, about those 7 people we pulled from the flames, about the old woman who cried all the way to the checkpoint. I wonder what happened to them. I wonder if they survived, if they made it through the rest of the war, if they rebuilt their lives somewhere else. I wonder if they think about that day the way I do, if it haunts them the way it haunts me, or if they found a way to forgive or forget or move on in a way I never could. I wonder if they hate me, if they curse my name, if they tell their grandchildren stories about the American soldiers who burned their home. I wonder if they ever think about us at all, or if we're just one trauma in a lifetime of traumas, one bad day in a war full of bad days. And I wonder about the meaning of it all, about whether what we did in Vietnam accomplished anything except creating more pain, more suffering, more people like me who carry the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives. We were told we were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the South Vietnamese people. We were told we were stopping the spread of communism, protecting America's interests, doing something noble and necessary. But all I remember is burning a village and nearly killing 7 people who'd done nothing except have the misfortune of living in a place that was strategically inconvenient. The older I get, the more I think about the nature of evil. When I was young, I thought evil was something obvious, something you could recognize. Monsters with swastikas, villains with clear malicious intent. But Vietnam taught me that evil is usually much more banal than that. Evil is following orders without questioning them. Evil is seeing a tunnel and immediately assuming guilt. Evil is being scared and angry and taking it out on whoever happens to be nearby. Evil is good people doing terrible things because they've been trained to see the world in a certain way, because they're part of a system that grinds up humans and spits out justifications. I don't know if we were the bad guys in Vietnam. I don't know if there were even good guys and bad guys, or if there were just people trying to survive, people following orders, people doing what they thought was right or necessary, or simply what they were told to do. I know that we caused tremendous pain and suffering to people who probably didn't deserve it. I know that we destroyed villages and families and lives in the name of abstract strategic goals that made sense on paper, but meant nothing to the people whose homes we burned. And I know that I've spent 50 years trying to reconcile the person I was before Vietnam with the person I became there and the person I've been since. They're not the same people. The kid who got on that plane to Tan Son Nhut in 1968 was someone who believed in clear lines between right and wrong, who trusted authority, who thought war was something noble and heroic. The man who came back in 1970 was someone who'd learned that the lines were never clear, that authority could lead you astray, that what was mostly confusion and fear and people doing their best to survive until they could go home. And the old man I am now is someone who spent half a century trying to make peace with what happened, trying to understand it, trying to forgive himself for his part in it, and mostly failing. If I could go back, if I could change one thing, it would be that day in September 1969. I would have said something when Crane gave the order to burn the village. I would have asked questions, demanded proof, insisted we search more thoroughly before destroying everything. I would have been the voice of doubt in a situation that demanded certainty, the voice of caution in a moment of anger and fear. But I didn't. I stayed silent. I followed orders. I was a good soldier, and being a good soldier meant I became a bad person, or at least someone who did bad things. And I've never found a way to separate those two identities in a way that allows me to live with myself comfortably. The worst part is the randomness of it. If we'd arrived at that village an hour earlier or an hour later, if Crane had been in a different mood, if we hadn't lost 3 guys the week before, if the intelligence report had been worded differently, if we hadn't found those tunnels, any one of these variables could have changed everything. The village might still be standing. Those 7 people might have lived out their lives in the place their ancestors had lived for generations. And I might have come home from Vietnam with different nightmares, or maybe no nightmares at all, though that seems unlikely. Vietnam gave everyone nightmares. It's just that mine have a very specific address. I tried therapy in the 90s when PTSD became something people actually talked about instead of just calling it shell shock or battle fatigue or simply weakness. The therapist was a young woman, couldn't have been more than 30, and she had all the training and all the empathy and all the techniques that were supposed to help veterans process their trauma. She wanted me to talk about my feelings, to examine my guilt, to work through the moral injury I'd sustained. And I tried, I really did. I sat in her office with its calming beige walls and its box of tissues and its poster about the stages of grief, and I tried to explain what it felt like to carry this thing around for 30 years. "You were following orders," she said, leaning forward with earnest concern. "You were in an impossible situation. You were 19 years old in a war zone. You can't hold yourself responsible for the decisions of your commanding officer." But that's the thing, I was responsible. Not legally, maybe, not in any way that would hold up in a court-martial or a war crimes tribunal, but morally, in the deep place where you know right from wrong regardless of what orders you've been given. I had a choice. We all had choices, even if we didn't feel like we did at the time. I could have refused. I could have spoken up. I could have done something other than pull out my lighter and set fire to someone's home. Sure, there would have been consequences, maybe a court-martial, maybe getting labeled as a coward or a troublemaker, maybe losing the respect of my unit. But those consequences would have been mine to bear, and they would have been lighter than the weight I've carried instead. The therapy didn't help. After 6 sessions, I stopped going. The therapist called a few times, left messages about how important it was to continue the work, but I never called back. What was the point? She could give me all the cognitive behavioral techniques in the world, all the mindfulness exercises, all the reframing strategies, but none of them could change what happened. None of them could unburn that village. None of them could give those people back what we took from them. My son came to visit me last month. He's 48 now, a software engineer in California, with 2 teenagers of his own. We don't talk much, maybe once every few months, birthday cards and Christmas, the bare minimum of family connection. But he drove all the way from the Bay Area to see me in this assisted living facility where I've ended up, and that meant something. We sat in the common room, surrounded by other old people watching game shows or sleeping in wheelchairs, and he asked me a question he'd never asked before. "Dad, what happened to you over there?" "In Vietnam." I looked at him, this middle-aged man who I'd barely been present for when he was growing up, who I'd failed in all the ways fathers can fail their sons, and I thought about telling him. Really telling him. Not the sanitized version, not the war stories that make you sound heroic or at least competent, but the truth. The village, the flames, the old woman, the 50 years of guilt. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was a lot of things happened. Too many to tell. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer. like he'd known I wouldn't really let him in. Mom said you had nightmares. She said you'd wake up screaming sometimes. Your mother talked to you about that? Not when I was a kid. Later, after the divorce. I asked her why you guys split up, and she said it wasn't your fault, that the war had damaged you in ways that made it hard for you to be present, to be a partner. She didn't blame you. She just said it was sad that the war kept taking casualties long after it ended. I felt something break loose in my chest, some piece of ice that had been frozen there for decades. Your ex-wife defending you to your son, understanding, even if she couldn't live with the consequences of that understanding. She was a good woman, is a good woman. I'm sorry I couldn't be what she needed. What did you need, Dad? Did anyone ever ask you that? Nobody had. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. The VA had asked what symptoms I was experiencing, what medications might help manage them. The therapist had asked about my feelings and my coping mechanisms. But nobody had ever asked what I needed, what would actually help, what might make it possible to live with what I'd done and seen. I don't know. I said finally. Forgiveness, maybe, but I don't know who to ask for it. My son reached across and put his hand on mine, and the gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that I almost started crying right there in the common room surrounded by strangers. Maybe you need to forgive yourself, he said. It's what everyone says, isn't it? Forgive yourself. Let go. You did your best in an impossible situation. But how do you forgive yourself for something you're not even sure deserves forgiveness? How do you let go of something that feels like the truest thing about you? The defining moment that separated who you were from who you became. I think about the old woman every day. Not deliberately. It's not like I sit down and decide to think about her. She just appears in moments between other thoughts, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the middle of conversations about weather or medications or what's for lunch. I see her face, streaked with soot and tears. I hear her voice, high and keening. I smell the smoke from her burning home. She's more real to me than most of the people in this assisted living facility, more present than my own memories of my children's childhoods, or my wedding day, or 1,000 other moments that should matter more, but somehow don't. Sometimes I imagine meeting her now, both of us old, both of us near the end. I imagine sitting down with her and trying to explain why we burned her village, trying to make her understand about the tunnels and the gunfire and the orders and the fear. And in these imaginary conversations, sometimes she forgives me. She says she understands that war makes people do terrible things, that she doesn't hold it against me personally. But more often, she just looks at me with those wide, terrified eyes and asks the same question she asked 50 years ago, why? Why did you do this to me? What did I do to deserve this? And I have no answer. Not then, not now. Because the truth is she didn't do anything. She was just there, living her life in a place that happened to be strategically inconvenient for the US military. And we burned it because we could, because we were angry, because we were scared, because following orders was easier than thinking about what those orders meant. The chaplain here at the facility came to see me a few weeks ago. He does regular rounds, visiting residents, offering comfort and prayer and spiritual guidance. He's a young guy, earnest and well-meaning, probably in his early 30s, with a theology degree and a calling to serve the elderly. He asked if I wanted to talk about my relationship with God, and I almost laughed because God and I haven't been on speaking terms since 1969. I did something in Vietnam. I told him, something I'm not sure God can forgive. He got that look they all get, that mixture of concern and professional compassion. God can forgive anything if you're truly repentant. What if I don't know if I'm repentant? What if I still think maybe we had to do it, even though I know it was wrong? What if I can't separate military necessity from moral failure? Can't figure out where following orders ends and personal responsibility begins? The chaplain was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, maybe that's the real wound. Not what you did, but your inability to know how to feel about it. The moral uncertainty. He was right, in a way. The not knowing is worse than knowing. If I could be certain we were wrong, I could repent cleanly, ask for forgiveness, try to make amends. If I could be certain we were right, I could defend our actions, justify them, live with them without guilt. But I exist in this gray space where I believe both that we had reasons for what we did and that those reasons don't matter, that we were following legitimate military protocols, and that those protocols were fundamentally immoral, that I'm guilty and that I'm a victim, that I should have done something different, and that there was nothing different I could have done. This is what Vietnam did to a lot of us. It shattered our moral certainty, left us unable to construct a coherent narrative about what we participated in. We couldn't be heroes because we'd done terrible things. We couldn't be villains because we'd been following orders in service of what we'd been told were righteous goals. We were just men caught in a machine that ground up everything it touched, and we came out the other side broken in ways that never quite healed. I've been writing this all down, these memories and reflections, in a notebook my son brought me. My handwriting is shaky now, arthritis making every letter a small struggle. But I push through because I think maybe this is my last chance to bear witness, to put it all on record before I die and the truth dies with me. Not that it's just my truth. There are probably thousands of veterans who carry similar stories, villages they burned or people they killed or atrocities they witnessed or participated in. We're dying now, the Vietnam generation, getting old and sick and disappearing, taking our stories with us. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe the world doesn't need to know all the ugly details. Maybe it's enough that we carried this weight so that others wouldn't have to know about it. But that feels like cowardice to me, like we're hiding the true cost of war, sanitizing it for future generations who might then be more willing to send their children to die in similar disasters. If we don't talk about the villages we burned, who will remember that war is more than brave soldiers fighting for freedom? Who will remember that it's also terror and confusion and moral injury that lasts decades? There was another guy in my unit, Donnelly, who made it home but killed himself in 1973. Drove his car into a concrete abutment at 70 miles per hour, no skid marks, no attempt to brake. His wife told someone who told someone else who eventually told me that he'd left a note, just 2 sentences. I can't stop seeing their faces. I'm sorry. I think about Donnelly a lot. I understand the impulse, the desire to just make it stop, to escape the endless replay of memories that won't fade, the faces that won't leave you alone. But I never had the courage to follow him. Or maybe it wasn't courage, but cowardice. Maybe ending it would have been the brave choice, and continuing to live with it is the coward's path. I don't know. I've never known. What I do know is that I'm tired. Tired of carrying this. Tired of waking up at 3 in the morning seeing smoke and flames. Tired of flinching at loud noises. Tired of the distance between who I am and who I might have been if I'd never gone to Vietnam. Or if I'd gone and somehow come back less damaged. Or if I'd had the courage to refuse orders I knew were wrong. I'm tired of being a cautionary tale, a case study in PTSD, a statistic in the long-term costs of war. But mostly I'm tired of not knowing if I did the right thing or the wrong thing or something in between. I'm tired of the moral uncertainty, the gray space where nothing is clear and everything is complicated. I'm tired of trying to explain it to people who can never understand, and tired of not explaining it to people who deserve to know. I'm tired of remembering and tired of trying to forget and tired of the way memory works. Holding on to the things you most want to release while letting go of the things you most want to keep. My grandson came to visit last week. My son's oldest boy, 17 years old, talking about maybe joining the military after high school. Smart kid, idealistic, full of notions about service and honor and defending freedom. He asked me if he should enlist, if I thought military service was valuable, if I was proud of my time in Vietnam. I looked at this boy, this young man really, with his whole life ahead of him, with choices still to make and paths still open, and I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to describe the heat and the fear and the moral ambiguity. I wanted to explain about villages that burn and old women who cry and the weight of guilt that never quite lifts. I wanted to beg him not to go, not to put himself in a position where he might have to follow orders that conflict with his conscience, where he might become someone he doesn't recognize, where he might spend the next 50 years trying to reconcile what he did with who he thinks he is. But what I said was, that's a decision you have to make for yourself. Just go in with your eyes open. Don't believe everything they tell you about glory and heroism. War is mostly just surviving, and the surviving doesn't end when you come home. He nodded thoughtfully, And I could see him processing this, trying to read between the lines, maybe sensing there was more I wasn't saying. And maybe he'll make a different choice because of that conversation, or maybe he won't. Maybe he'll enlist anyway and find his own village to burn, his own old woman to remember for the rest of his life. And if he does, I hope he has more courage than I did. I hope he questions orders that seem wrong. I hope he speaks up even when it's hard. I hope he chooses his conscience over his career, his humanity over his duty. But probably he won't, because that's not how it works. You're young and scared and surrounded by other young, scared people. And you trust the officers to know what they're doing, and you follow orders because that's what soldiers do. And by the time you realize you should have done something different, it's too late. The village is already burning, and all you could do is live with it or die trying to escape it. The physical reminders of Vietnam are fading from my body now. The shrapnel scar on my leg is just another mark among many, indistinguishable from the scars of age and illness. My hearing is mostly gone. Too many explosions, too many rifle reports too close to my ears. But now it's mixed with the general deterioration of old age. Even the limp has been subsumed into a more general infirmity, my whole body failing in ways that have nothing to do with war. But the mental reminders remain sharp, unchanged by time. I can still smell that burning thatch as clearly as I did 50 years ago. I can still see the flames consuming those hooches, still hear the old woman's crying, still feel the weight of the Zippo lighter in my hand. These memories haven't faded or softened or become manageable. They're as vivid and painful at 74 as they were at 21. Sometimes I wonder if that's my punishment. Not legal punishment, not divine retribution, but just the natural consequence of having been part of something I can't resolve in my mind or heart. The punishment is living with it, carrying it, never being able to put it down or walk away from it. The punishment is becoming the old man in the assisted living facility who flinches at fireworks, who can't sleep without medication, who keeps a notebook full of memories he can barely stand to write down. There's a woman here, Mrs. Chun, whose family came from Vietnam in 1975, refugees from the fall of Saigon. She's younger than me, maybe 65, here because of early onset dementia. We sometimes sit together in the common room, not talking much, just existing in proximity. I've never told her I was in Vietnam. I've never asked her about her experiences during the war. There's an unspoken agreement between us not to open those doors, not to bridge that particular gap. But sometimes I look at her and wonder if she knew people like the old woman from the village, if she lost her home the way those 7 people lost theirs, if she has her own memories that won't fade, her own scars that time can't heal. And I wonder if she can somehow sense what I did, if there's some way that history leaves a mark on us that others can recognize. Does she see me as the enemy? As a reminder of trauma? Or am I just another old man in an assisted living facility, someone to share space with while we both wait for the end? I'll never ask. Some conversations are too dangerous to have, some truths too painful to acknowledge. We sit together in our shared silence, 2 people marked by the same war from different sides, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's as close as we can come to reconciliation, just existing in the same space without violence, without hatred, without the need to justify or explain or defend. My time is running out. The doctors have stopped being optimistic, stopped talking about treatments, and started talking about comfort and quality of life. I have months, maybe a year, and as I face whatever comes next, oblivion or judgment or something I can't imagine, I find myself still thinking about that village, still carrying those 7 people with me, still hearing that old woman's question. Why? I don't have an answer. Not after 50 years of thinking about it. Not after decades of trying to understand and explain and justify. All I have is the memory and the guilt and the wish that I'd been braver, better, different. All I have is this notebook full of words that probably won't change anything, won't ease anyone's suffering, won't bring back what was destroyed. But maybe bearing witness is enough. Maybe telling the truth, even when it's ugly and complicated and doesn't resolve into anything clean or simple, is the only redemption available. Maybe the village I burned will outlive me in these words, will exist as a warning or a lesson or just a record of what happened, of what we were capable of doing to each other in the name of war and duty and following orders. The village we were ordered to burn still haunts me 50 years later. It will haunt me until I die. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some things shouldn't be forgiven or forgotten or resolved. Maybe some wounds should keep bleeding, should keep hurting, should keep reminding us of what we're capable of when we stop questioning, when we stop thinking, when we stop being fully human and become just soldiers following orders. I was 19 years old, and I helped burn a village, and I nearly killed 7 people who'd done nothing wrong except be in a wrong place at the wrong time. This is my truth. This is my confession. This is the weight I've carried and will carry until there's no more carrying left to do. And somewhere out there, if they're still alive, those 7 people carry their own truth, their own memories of that day. I hope they survived. I hope they rebuilt. I hope they found some measure of peace that I never could. And I hope that someday, somehow, in this life or whatever comes after, I can tell them I'm sorry. Not because it will change anything, but because it's the only thing left to say. The notebook is almost full now. My handwriting has deteriorated so much that I can barely read what I wrote last week. The nurses found me yesterday, slumped over these pages, and they thought I'd had a stroke, but I'd just fallen asleep mid-sentence, the pen still clutched in my arthritic fingers. They suggested maybe I should rest more, write less, but they don't understand. There isn't time for rest. There's only time to finish this, to get it all down before the words stop coming or I stop being able to form them. Last night, I had a dream that was different from the nightmares. I was back in a village, but it wasn't burning. It was late afternoon, golden light filtering through the banana trees, and I was sitting by the well in the center of the village. The old woman was there, but she was younger somehow, or maybe I was seeing her as she'd been before the war, before we came. She was drawing water from the well, and she looked at me without fear, without recognition. In a dream, I stood up and walked toward her, and I said in perfect Vietnamese, a language I never learned, never spoke, "I'm sorry for what we did to you. I'm sorry for what I took from you. I've carried you with me every day since." And she set down her water bucket and looked at me with eyes that were impossibly old and impossibly kind. And she said, "I know. I'll watch you carry it. You can put it down now." "I don't know how," I said. "You've already done it," she replied. "You've remembered us. You kept us alive in your memory. You've let it hurt. That's all anyone can do." I woke up crying, real tears on my face, and the night nurse came in and asked if I was in pain, if I needed medication. But it wasn't pain exactly. It was something else, something I don't have a word for. Relief mixed with grief, mixed with a kind of exhausted gratitude that maybe, finally, after 50 years, something had shifted. I don't believe in messages from the dead or in dreams as prophecy. I know it was just my own mind trying to give me what I couldn't give myself, trying to create the forgiveness I'd never received from the actual people I'd harmed. But it helped anyway, not in a way that erased anything or made it better, but in a way that made it bearable, made it possible to imagine reaching the end of my life without this weight crushing me completely. This morning, I asked my son to come visit again. He drove up from California, rearranged his work schedule, and sat with me in my room. They moved me out of the common areas last week because I need more care now, more monitoring. He brought his youngest daughter with him, my granddaughter Emily, who's 13 and wants to be a writer. She brought a notebook of her own, filled with stories and poems, and she asked if she'd inherited her writing from me. I don't know about inherited, I told her, but I've been writing something, a true story, about Vietnam. My son's eyes met mine, a question in them. I nodded slightly. "Would you read it?" I asked them both. "After I'm gone? I'm leaving it with my things. It's important someone knows the whole truth, not just the sanitized version." "Dad, you don't have to," my son started, but I cut him off. "Yes, I do. I should have told you years ago. I should have trusted you with the truth. I thought I was protecting you by keeping it hidden, but I was really just protecting myself from having to face it, from having to see what you'd think of me once you knew." Emily looked between us, sensing the weight of something she didn't fully understand. "What happened in Vietnam, Grandpa?" I looked at this young girl, this bright soul who still believed the world made sense, who still thought there were clear lines between right and wrong. and I realized I couldn't tell her directly. Not yet. She was too young, too innocent, and I couldn't be the one to shatter that innocence. But the notebook would be there when she was older, when she was ready to understand that good people can do terrible things, that war destroys everyone it touches, that carrying the weight of your actions is its own kind of courage. I made mistakes, I said carefully. I did things I regret because I was scared and young and didn't question orders I should have questioned. And I've spent my whole life trying to understand what that means about who I am. Are you a bad person? She asked with the directness only children possess. I thought about it for a long moment. I don't think I'm a bad person, but I participated in bad things. And maybe the distinction doesn't matter as much as I've always wanted it to. My son put his hand on my shoulder. You're human, Dad. That's what you are. Human and flawed and carrying something heavy for a very long time. That doesn't make you bad. It makes you honest. After they left, I sat alone with this notebook and thought about what comes next. I'm not afraid of dying anymore. I was for a long time afraid of judgment, afraid of facing whatever cosmic accounting might await, afraid that death would be just another version of the torture I'd been living with. But now I think death might be rest, finally. Not escape, not erasure, but just rest. I've arranged for this notebook to be sent to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund after my death. There's a program where veterans can leave letters and artifacts, contributions to the historical record. Maybe someone will read this someday and learn something from it. Maybe it will sit in an archive unread. Just another voice in a chorus of voices trying to process what we went through. Either way, it will exist outside of me, a testimony that survives even after I'm gone. I've also arranged for a donation in the name of those 7 people. The old woman, the old man, the 3 younger women, the 2 children. I don't know their real names, never learned them. So the donation just says for the survivors of an unnamed village in Din Tuong province, September 1969. It's going to an organization that removes unexploded ordnance from Vietnam, that helps with prosthetics for people who've lost limbs to old mines, that tries to heal some of the wounds we left behind. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something, a gesture toward making amends for what can never truly be repaired. Yesterday, Mrs. Chun from down the hall came in my room. The nurses must have told her I was declining, that I didn't have much time left. She sat in the chair by my bed, and we existed together in our usual silence. But after a while, she said in heavily accented English, "You were a soldier in my country?" I felt my throat tighten. Yes, I thought so. The way you hold yourself. The way you sometimes look at nothing and see everything. She was quiet for a moment. My family lost our home in the war. American bombs. We lived in refugee camp for 2 years before we could come here. I'm sorry, I said, and the words felt simultaneously too small and too large, inadequate and overwhelming. We all lost something, she said. Everyone who lived through that war. Soldier, civilian, North, South, American, Vietnamese. We all lost something we never got back. Does it get easier? Does the loss become bearable? She smiled sadly. No, but you learn to live next to it instead of inside it. You make room for other things, love, joy, peace. The loss is always there, but it doesn't have to be everything. We sat together until she had to go back for her medications, and after she left, I cried again, not the anguished tears of earlier years, but something gentler, more like release. She'd given me permission to be both things at once. Someone who caused harm and someone who suffered. Someone who carried guilt and someone who deserved peace. Not forgiveness exactly, but something like understanding. The hospice nurse came by this evening for her rounds. She's kind, efficient, treats death like a natural process rather than a failure or an enemy. She asked about my pain levels, adjusted my medications, and then asked if there was anything else I needed. Just time enough to finish, I said, gesturing at this notebook. Finish what? The story. My story. The true one. She nodded like she understood, even though she couldn't possibly know what I was talking about. Then I hope you get all the time you need. But I don't need much more now. The story is almost told. The village has been witnessed. The 7 people have been remembered. The weight has been acknowledged and examined and carried to the end of the line. I want to believe that my grandson won't enlist, that my granddaughter will read this someday and understand something about the cost of war that can't be learned any other way. I want to believe that somewhere in Vietnam, if any of those 7 people are still alive, they've found peace and healing and lives that weren't completely destroyed by what we did. I want to believe that the village we burned has been rebuilt, that children play there now who have no memory of flames, that the land has reclaimed its innocence even if we never could. But belief doesn't change what happened. Belief doesn't unburn the village or undo the trauma or erase the 50 years I've spent carrying this weight. Belief is just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of things that might not have any sense to be made. What I know, the only thing I can say with certainty after 50 years of thinking and remembering and trying to understand, is that war breaks everything it touches. It breaks bodies and minds and families and villages and souls. It breaks the people who fight and the people who flee and the people who give orders and the people who follow them. It broke me in 1969, and I've been broken ever since, trying to function as a broken thing in a world that doesn't have much patience for brokenness. But maybe being broken isn't the same as being worthless. Maybe carrying this weight for 50 years has meant something, has taught something, has prevented something. Maybe my grandson will read this and choose differently. Maybe someone else will read this and question an order they wouldn't have questioned otherwise. Maybe the act of bearing witness, of refusing to forget or minimize or justify, is itself a form of resistance against the machinery that creates these tragedies in the first place. Or maybe I'm just an old man trying to find meaning in suffering, trying to convince myself that the pain was for something, that it mattered in some cosmic ledger. Maybe there is no meaning, no lesson, no redemption. Maybe the village burned and 7 people lost everything, and I carry the guilt for 50 years, and it all adds up to nothing except more pain in a world already full of pain. I don't know. After everything, after all these words, I still don't know. What I do know is that I'm tired. I'm ready to rest. I'm ready to stop carrying this. I'm ready to put down the weight and see what happens next, whether that's judgment or mercy or simply the end of consciousness and concern. I'm ready to close this notebook and close my eyes and trust that I've done what I could do, that I've been as honest as I could be, that I've earned whatever small measure of peace might be available to someone like me. The village we were ordered to burn still haunts me. It will haunt me until my last breath. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being haunted is better than forgetting. Maybe carrying the weight is better than setting it down too easily. Maybe the only honor I can give to those 7 people, to that old woman whose face I still see every day, is to let their story hurt, to let it matter, to refuse the comfortable amnesia that would make my life easier but would erase them completely. So I remember. I carry them with me to the end. And when I'm gone, these words will remain, a testament to what happened in one small village in the Mekong Delta in September 1969, to the people who lost everything, and to the soldier who helped take it from them and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that meant. This is my last entry. My hand is shaking too much to write anymore. The pain medication is making it hard to focus. But it's done. The story is told. The witness is born. To whoever reads this, remember that every war creates stories like mine. Remember that orders don't absolve responsibility. Remember that the cost of war isn't just measured in bodies and bullets, but in souls and sleep and all the invisible wounds that never heal. Remember the villages that burn and the people who lose everything and the soldiers who come home broken and spend decades trying to piece themselves back together. And if you have the power to prevent another war, another village, another 19-year-old kid who'll spend the rest of his life haunted by orders he followed, then for God's sake, do it. Remember us. Remember all of us. The dead and the living and the ones caught in between. Remember, Robert James Mitchell, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment. Vietnam 1968, 1970. The notebook was found on Robert James Mitchell's bedside table 3 days after his death on October 17, 2019. He was 74 years old. As per his instructions, it was donated to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund Archives. where it remains available to researchers and the public. The village he described has never been definitively identified, but oral histories collected from Vietnamese survivors describe dozens of similar incidents throughout the Mekong Delta during the American War. The 7 people he pulled from the flames, if they survived, would now be in their 70s or 80s. Their names and fates remain unknown.